The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center, I would like to welcome you to our webinar, a conversation regarding coronavirus and how it might affect your small water system's finances and management. My name is Savannah Bekowski, and I work for the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. We have a great webinar set up for today, but first there are a few logistics to cover. Everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time throughout the session. We will be answering questions throughout this entire webinar. We will be posting the presentation from today, as well as a video recording on our website. You can reach that website at www.efcnetwork.org. You will also receive a follow-up email that includes a link to all of these materials. We do not submit our webinars to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. We do provide certificates of attendance as a courtesy. It can take up to 1 to 2 weeks to send out the certificates of attendance, and you must attend this entire webinar to receive one. You also must have joined using the unique join link that was emailed to you. We cannot guarantee that this webinar will meet requirements for specific CEU or licensing renewal needs, but if you have any other questions about this, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. And for a little bit about us here at the Environmental Finance Center Network, our program provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that we have centers and program organizations spread across the entire country. We work together to create solutions for difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We have Shadi Eskoff with the Environmental Finance Center at UNC, Heather Himmelberger with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center in New Mexico, and Aaron Riggs, also with the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. So Shadi, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Savannah. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. All right, thank you everybody for joining us. We have been looking at the questions that you've all been submitting to us part of the registration, and we know there are other questions as well that you might have. So I will encourage you to be posting questions as we go through this, this webinar during this hour in the questions box. Now, if at any point you have some experiences or you want to share with the audience how you're doing, how you're dealing with some of the issues that we're talking about so that you can learn from each other, in the chat box, not in the questions box, but in the chat box, feel free to submit what those comments or what those issues and what those experiences that you're having are, and send that to the entire audience, not just to the organizing panelists. So that will be another way to share some of your experiences as well. The questions that came in have been centered around several different types of topics. So we will try to address the topics that you see on the screen right now. We're going to start off by talking about helping customers stay connected to water. So issues of disconnections, late fees, waivers, collections, and so forth. We'll talk about loss of revenues for the water systems, because there will be loss of revenues. We'll talk about the financial relief that's available, whether externally from state and federal agencies, or how you can deal with those losses internally with your own finances. Then Heather will be talking about some of the things that you can do or start preparing for when it comes to system operations, and what some of the other agencies are also recommending that systems do. And she'll talk about some resiliency, some resilience measures that water systems can take as well. Towards the end, we'll talk about assistance that's available to you from other organizations or some resources that you could tap into, including resources from the EFC network. So I'll just mention right now that for small water systems, fewer than 10,000, who serve fewer than 10,000 people, if you have issues related to the finance or management of your system because of COVID-19, you can go to our website, efcnetwork.org, and under request assistance, you can submit a request and we will contact you and work with you one-on-one. And that's all free of charge for the system, thanks to a cooperative agreement that we have with US EPA. And then we'll have time for more questions later on. So along the way, we'll stop for questions. If you have questions related to these topics, I would recommend that you wait for the time that we're talking about that one topic so that you can at least hear what we have to say first before you submit your question, because I think we're getting a lot of similar questions that we're going to try to address before you submit them. All right, let me pause real quick and see if there's anything that we need to address right away. Hearing nothing from Savannah, I'm going to keep going. So there's a lot of interest in this topic. Water systems across the country have been dealing with COVID-19 for a few weeks now, and will probably continue to deal with the aftermath of that for a few months as well. But this is just a snapshot of who registered for the webinar as of 24 hours ago. It's all over, literally all over the map. All right, let's talk about helping customers keep access to water. As you all know, a lot of states have stay-at-home orders right now, or if they don't, basically most businesses have now sent their employees home or have shut down or have reduced hours, and a lot of people are basically staying at home because of social distancing, because of stay-at-home orders, and we need access to water in order to wash our hands and to keep up with hygiene so that we can fight this disease. So a lot of systems, when this came into play, a lot of water utilities immediately jumped on the idea of providing water, making sure that everybody has access to water, at least in the residences, so that they're not stuck at home without access to water and inability to wash their hands and do what they need to do, at least temporarily while we're in this current condition. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to just kind of mention that this is an important topic, because water systems, you are on the front lines of public health in this case, and hospitals are dealing with people who are getting sick. You are trying to deal with making sure that people don't get sick and don't have to go to the hospital. So I want to thank everybody here who is working for a water system, and for those who are helping water systems provide that public service and public health to everybody here during this difficult time. So some of the common practices that we're seeing relating to helping customers stay connected to water. A lot of systems have suspended cutoffs due to non-payment. That could be either because they voluntarily chose to do that, because they think that's the right thing to do for their customers, or because there's an order or a mandate from the state to do that. As of this morning, it looks like there have been at least a dozen states across the country who have mandated suspension of cutoffs due to non-payment across the board for all water utilities, not just for regulated utilities. And there's another dozen or so states that have mandated that suspension of cutoffs for regulated utilities. So those are regulated by the Public Service Commission or Utilities Commission. So a lot of systems are currently suspending cutoffs due to non-payments, and there are issues with how do you deal with billings and collections. I'll talk about that in a second. In addition to suspending cutoffs, some utilities go beyond that, and some of the mandates go beyond that and require reconnecting customers who were previously cut off. So if you're cut off before COVID-19, do you go back and reconnect them and provide them with water, or do you not do that? And this one we see a little bit more variation amongst utilities and amongst what the state mandates are. There are some, either again, state mandates, or some utilities are voluntarily suspending or waiving late fees and penalties, because customers right now, residential customers right now, are dealing with a lot of financial difficulty, especially a lot of people who've been either laid off or temporarily don't have a job, and there's some financial difficulties for more and more people in this country. One of the ways to try to avoid having customers, not have access to water, in addition to suspension of cutoffs, is to waive the late fees and penalties. In some cases, this is a requirement created by the state as well. So I know in North Carolina, that is one of the things that we cannot charge late fees or penalties for the next 60 days as part of the state executive order. So how do you deal with this? If you're not cutting off customers for non-payments, if you're reconnecting customers that were previously not paying their bills, and if you're not charging late fees and penalties, what's the incentive for the customer to pay their bill on time and basically not wait until and not wait for you to tell them that you're not done cutting them off? There are a couple of things that you should know. suspension of cutoffs or reconnecting customers cutoffs or waiving late fees and penalties does not mean that you're not charging customers their monthly bill. And that does not mean that those bills are not going to continue to accrue over time. So that's one of the misconceptions that some customers might have. If you're not cutting them off, that means that they're off the hook and they don't have to pay their bill. That's not true, because that bill is going to still be on the books. And at some point, once we're past COVID-19 and you resume to normal operations where you would cut off people for non-payment, if they have not been paying their bills along the way and are fully paid up by the time you return to normal operations, you could cut them off at that point. So there is still the threat of cutoff for non-payment at the end of this period. It's just during this period where everybody's at home that you're not going to be cutting them off for public health reasons. So how can you help customers deal with this? One is to remind them that the bills are still due, that they should pay on time, and that even if you're not charging late fees and penalties, that those bills are accruing over time, and at some point you will be resuming cutoffs going forward. You could create extended payment plans or customize your payment plan. So some utilities have suspended cutoffs, and for those customers who would be cut off, automatically get added to an extended payment plan of varying lengths. It could be 2 months, it could be 6 months, it could be something different. And sometimes utilities would say, we're going to ask you to pay a fixed amount every month, $10 a month, $20 a month, until the end of the extended payment period, and then everything else is due. Sometimes it's just an extension of what the deadline is for paying those bills. And then there are alternative payment methods as well. So you can add them to auto draft. You can add them to ask them to sign up for credit card payments, and then you can waive the credit card fees that are the convenience fees that are usually charged with those kind of payments as an incentive for customers to sign up and to pay their bills on time, and to keep that going. And then in addition to all that, some utilities look to customer assistance programs or ways to help pay for the bills of customers who cannot pay their bills. So we know that this is typically a situation that utilities are dealing with constantly. Just even in normal operations, there's usually a large number of customers who can't pay their bills. And water systems have been looking more and more into creating these kind of programs that would financially assist customers who can't pay to pay their bills and stay connected to the water systems. There's a little bit more interest in that these days because of COVID-19 and the situation that we're all in. To pay for that, there are some state-specific requirements and state-specific legal issues that you have to navigate. So there's this resource here. Once you have the PowerPoint slides, you can click on this link. There's a resource here that shows you for each state whether or not you could use your own utility revenues to help or to create this kind of fund to help customers pay their bills, or if you need to look to other sources of revenue. So in a lot of states, you can't use water revenues to create this fund, and you'd have to look either to the general fund if you were a local government, or for donations and charity, or fundraising for other types of utilities as well. So I'm going to pause here and ask you all to fill in a poll question. Savannah, if you don't mind launching that one. We'd just like to know whether or not you've already suspended disconnections for non-payments during this period, just COVID-19 periods. If you're thinking about it or planning to, or if no, you haven't suspended. And if you're not a water system, you can either skip it, or I think there's an option for no response.
Great, so we'll leave this poll open for just a few more moments here.
And while we're doing this, if you've already answered, if you have questions on disconnections, please submit them now. So we're going to stop here and take some questions on this topic for the next few minutes.
All right, so I'll get ready to close this poll in about 3, 2, 1. And here are the results. Shadi, are you able to see those?
Unfortunately not if I'm still sharing my screen.
Okay, so it looks like as of right now from the responses, 60% of attendees, this question is not applicable or they're not a water system. 29% are indicating yes, 6% are indicating not yet, but working on it, and 5% answered no.
Okay, so the majority of the water systems on this call have already suspended cutoffs. and you may be dealing with some of the questions or some of the issues about how to handle finances or how to handle cutoffs in certain situations. If you want to share your experiences, put them in the chat box. If you have questions, please submit them in the question box. But thank you. It sounds like very few utilities are not doing suspension of cutoffs at this point. Okay. I think we can end the poll. So we can take questions now. Are there any questions for us at this time, Savannah?
I am not seeing, I am not.
Savannah, there is one question that came in, but I'll just mention it. And it's not directly related to the subject at hand, but I think it's a really important one, and it's one that our EFC here in New Mexico is thinking a lot about. And it's a question about, why aren't we pushing harder to hail water system operators as heroes, much like the medical professionals, and just talking about how we're not really doing enough to let people know that the water utilities are on the front lines. And I just wanted to mention that I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment, that I think we should be doing way, way more to let people know that the water professionals are super important at this time. And we'll talk more about that later in the webinar, of just about everything that all of the water utilities are doing right now to keep the water running is really helping make us safe. How do we wash our hands in clean water if there is no clean water available? So I do want to give a shout out to all of those of you who are on from water utilities, and just thank you for all you're doing at this time, and the fact that you guys are continuing to work on the front lines during a time when many of the others of us, including those of us on the webinar, are at home. So again, I totally agree with you, and our EFC is working on a podcast in New Mexico where we're going to be interviewing some water operators and managers to just discuss that very issue and let people here in our state know that the water people, the water utility people, are still working, and they're out there making the water run every day to keep all of us as safe as possible while we're working from home and sheltering in place and those types of things. So thank you for your question/comment, and I wholeheartedly agree that utility workers are not getting enough credit at this time.
Thanks, Heather. And I completely support that too. I think that as much as possible, if we can share that, what utilities are doing for customers, and the fact that you're out there providing water in a time of need like this, we should definitely be doing that. And I know that water operators have been called essential employees from the federal government, as well as in different states as well. That should say something about how they're valued, at least from the government side. Know that the customers are also appreciative of your work. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm seeing the chat box now. So I just saw a question come in about disconnecting customers with leaks. So I've been talking about suspension of disconnections for non-payment. This is a question about, well, should we also suspend disconnections because of other reasons, like if there are leaks? If you're disconnecting a customer because you're fixing a leak, I think that's totally fine. I think that if you've got water main breaks or anything like that, you need to shut off customers to fix a situation, then you should continue to do that, and you should operate along those ways, and to communicate with your customers when you are going to be cutting off service temporarily. Now, what we're talking about here is those indefinite cutoffs because of non-payment. So if a customer is experiencing a leak and their bill goes up and they can't pay their bill, and you're going to be cutting them off because they can't pay their bill, then that is what we're talking about. You'll be suspending disconnections for that reason. And what you could, if they're still experiencing that leak and they're racking up those fees, you need to remind them that the bills are not being waived, that at some point they will have to pay those bills. So they should try to get a plumber in and fix that leak as soon as possible, so they can get whatever break you typically give them for leaks, whatever breaks you provide on the bills, I mean.
And one of the things to think about too, when this particular question, disconnecting customers with leaks, is the idea of how do you notify customers while practicing, good social distancing and that sort of thing. So it might be a little bit trickier to have customers turned off while you're repairing things. Normally, if you pick certain times of the day, hardly anybody is home. So your normal practice might be to try to time repairs so that you're hitting the least number of people being home. Well, that's very different right now. So more people are likely to be home at whatever time you're going to fix the leak. And if you want to let them know, trying to find ways of doing that without having to come in direct contact with your customers is a little bit trickier. So be thinking about that. Be thinking about ways, if you have more social media ways of doing that with texting or phone calls or things that can keep your employees away from direct contact with customers, that would be a better way of doing it. But you're probably going to have more of a need to let your customers know if you're shutting them off for repairs, because more people are going to be at home now than typically would be.
I see a question about whether or not there might be legal issues if the operator herself or himself chose to not cut off service to a customer. I would say that the suspension of disconnections should be done intentionally at the management level and should be communicated by the management. So if it's, first of all, if you're in a state where you're mandated to not have cutoffs, follow those legal guidances, and everybody should understand, should know that you'll be suspending disconnections. But if you're in a state that doesn't require that, and if your utility, if your boards, or if the managers have not decided to suspend cutoffs, and the operator is going out there and refusing to cut off customers, then I think that's a conversation that management needs to have with the operator. I don't know about any legal issues specifically related to that. I think this is something that the elected officials or the governing board needs to address first. Now, there are some, because of these circumstances where the managers might need to decide, we're going to suspend cutoffs, and then in the next board meeting talk about it and make sure that we're okay with the boards. I think that's possible. But I don't think that the operator themselves should make that decision unilaterally. They should at least communicate with the managers at the very least, and the elected officials or the governing board need to be on board with it whenever possible, as soon as possible as well. Erin, if you have an addition to that, please let me know, but I'm going to move on to the next question.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't have anything additional.
And I think the next one, Shadi, is one that came in about for utilities that have discontinued shutoffs for non-payment and waiving late fees. How do we go back to, quote, business as usual, unquote? What triggers should we be paying attention to, given that state and local politicians and advocates may have different ideas of the all clear trigger? So kind of a question about how do you know when to stop suspending disconnections, and how do you take your cues locally versus, at your water utility versus the state level?
I'll give a crack answer that question, but then Heather, if you've got some ideas, because I know you're thinking about the operations as well. But from what I understand, if there's a state mandate, there's usually some indication from the mandate how long, or if there's an executive order, how long this suspension of cutoffs, at least from the state, will take place, and they might keep extending it as long as COVID-19 is still an issue. So if it's a state mandate, usually there's some kind of a timeline. Now at the local level, or if there is no state mandate and you're disconnecting customers, what are some of the triggers that you could use to say, all right, we're going back to normal, we're going to start going back to normal? I think that you can judge that at the local level if you're noticing that that businesses are going back to normal, restaurants are back open, customers are leaving their homes and going back to their offices. If schools resume, I think that you could assess that locally. And as long as, again, there's no state requirements as far as continuing to suspend disconnections, I think that you can decide that at the local level. And I think that we all kind of saw this evolve very quickly in the past few weeks. And I think that we would probably see that evolve again, but maybe not as suddenly going forward. So I think that's more a local decision. But Heather, if you have something to add to that, feel free.
Yeah, and one thing that I was going to mention is just, again, making sure that the boards are making those decisions and that they have good rationale for why they're making the decision they're making. And one other point I wanted to make is the messaging around not shutting people off is super, super important. As Shadi mentioned, you don't want the message to be out there that it's just free for all, that if you have the ability to pay, you can just choose not to, or we don't want you to pay at this time, everything's fine. I mean, it's really, really important to consider messaging and how you're messaging the fact that you're not shutting the water off right now. And because we have seen the number of non-paying customers go up in some utilities where the message has gotten out there, and Louisville was on a webinar just the other day talking about how they put the message out originally, we're not shutting anybody off, and had to redo the messaging to say, well, that didn't mean we didn't want you to pay, and we do want you to pay whatever you can. And trying to think about how you want to message it to let customers know that you do expect payment, they will have to pay eventually, getting that information out there so that people are not perceiving it as, I get to just not pay and I'm not going to be cut off. So just keep that in mind, is how you want to message it is really, really important, so that you're thinking about what you're saying to your customers, how you're saying it, and letting them know you still need the revenue. It's not like your need for revenue went away just because coronavirus happened. So you have to make it clear that to keep the water running, you are going to have revenue.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next topic. I see some more questions have been submitted. We'll save some of those towards the end of the webinar as well, but I want to make sure that we have time for covering various topics as well. So keep the questions coming in and we'll try to get to them as soon as possible. Thank you. Let's talk about loss of revenue real quick. So again, because of suspension of cutoffs, if you're waiving late fees and penalties, if you're doing extension of payment plans, those all have some revenue effects at the utility. And again, we know that a lot of customers now have either lost their jobs or are on reduced hours. It's going to become, affordability is going to become more and more of an issue going forward. And the inability to pay as it continues to go up, and the fact that you're no longer cutting off customers for non-payment might mean that you'll see an increase, probably you'll see an increase in the rate of customers who are not paying their bills, at least not paying their bills on time or in full. So revenues are going to go down, even though they're accruing those charges. And because they're at home, residential use is going to go up, and water bills are going to go up for those residential customers. Your bills are going to go up, which means that the revenues from the residential sector should theoretically go up. But because people are not paying their bills, or or they're in extended payment plans where they're spreading out when they're paying the bills back to you, you might experience either a reduction in revenues that you're collecting in the short term from residential customers, or at least some cash flow issues where the revenues that you're expecting will be coming down 2-3 months down the line, as opposed to when they would normally be paid. So that's one issue. But really the effects on revenues, the biggest part, I think, is going to come from the non-residential sector. Because businesses have shut down, because restaurants are not offering service inside the restaurants, bars are shut down, lots of water using industry have either shut down or reduced operations. You're going to see a reduction in water use on the non-residential sector. Now this varies from utility to utility. You might be a water system that only serves residential customers, so this really has no effect in you, except that you might have higher increases in water demand because people are at home constantly using water. If you're a water system where you have 1 or 2 large industries, then this could be a very significant effect on your revenues. If those 2 industries either shut down or reduce their operations, you might lose quite a bit of your revenue. And just to give you a general sense of idea of what this might look like, nationwide, USGS estimated that about 60% of water demand that goes out from water utilities goes to residential side, which means that 40% goes to non-residential waters, as well as water losses and other types of water service. In North Carolina, this is just a graph to show you kind of what it looks like in North Carolina. We found that 1/3 of the water utilities in this state would provide water to a majority of non-residential customers than residential. Not the number of customers, but the volume of water that gets sold is going to a majority non-residential for 1/3 of these utilities. So at your utility, you might be one of those utilities where a significant portion of your revenues comes from the non-residential side. And if that's the case, then you can expect a very significant decrease in your revenues, at least in the short term, while we're in this current situation. So I'm going to continue talking, but Savannah, if you don't mind pulling up the second poll, I'd like to hear a little bit about your experiences with your revenues right now. We've been in this condition for 2 to 3 weeks or so. And so some utilities might have already seen that that non-residential water use is going down and that revenues might be going down going forward, or it might be too early to tell. But this is one that I think utilities are concerned about and have been asking about. And we've looked at some of the utilities, and anecdotally, like I said, it really varies from one to another. We've seen some utilities complaining that about half of their revenue is going away, and some utilities saying that it's not really affecting their revenues quite as much because they don't have quite as much non-residential customers, or that the suspensions of cover-ups is not really affecting the revenues. So hopefully you had enough time to respond to this poll question. Savannah, what kind of responses do we have?
So the majority of attendees, 80%, are saying it's too early to tell. 8% comes in with losing more than 20% of revenues. 5% is losing between 10 and 20%. 3% both comes in for losing less than 10%, and revenues are not declining.
Okay, so for those who are able to estimate it, it sounds like there's more utilities that are losing 20% or more, and then others are kind of less than that. The reason I asked about 20% or more is, I mean, it's just to get an idea of what the revenue situation is going to be like for systems. But I know that for some associations that advocate for water utilities, they have been pushing Congress to provide funding and stimulus and financial relief, essentially, to water utilities. And I'll talk about that in a second. And one of the things that they're talking about is that potentially they expect that possibly 20% of revenues will go down. If 20% of revenues go down for water utilities across the country, they're talking about $12.5 billion lost revenue. Now, the longer that this situation continues, the longer your revenue shortfall is going to be. So let's talk quickly about financial relief and how you can deal with those issues. First of all, is there financial relief? Is the federal government providing any kind of stimulus funding right now for water utilities? The short answer is no, unfortunately. The stimulus funds that have passed so far have not really addressed water utilities head on. I'll talk about future funding in a second. The most prominent of all of the stimulus bills and the acts that have passed so far is CARES, which is the $2.2 trillion stimulus funding that was passed in late March. That one has some funding available for local governments. It's about $150 billion worth of funding for local governments. Now, that was not really set aside for wastewater utilities. It's really set for local governments to be compensated for any expenditures that they have in dealing with COVID-19 that was not already budgeted in their budget. So it's really more for governmental activities. It's only going to be applied to local governments that are either municipalities, counties, or special units of governments that serve more than 500,000 people. So everybody here would not really, unless you're a municipality or county, you wouldn't be getting any of that. And again, it's not really aimed for water and wastewater utilities. Now, there's another part of the stimulus bill that was created for small businesses. There's a payroll protection plan, and then the EDIL or EIDL, economic injury. I forgot what the D stands for, but there are two funding programs available through this Small Business Administration that would provide relief for non-governmental systems or non-governmental entities that are losing revenue. Payroll protection plan is set up to help make sure that people can continue to be paid their full wages, and that you do not lay off or have to lay off or furlough some of your employees. And then the EDIL is essentially a loan to help you offset some of the expenses and losses that you might have that eventually gets paid back. Some of these include principal forgiveness, which basically means that they're essentially treated as a grant. So instead of providing you as a loan, it's being provided as a grant. What you need to know about payroll protection plan and the EIDL, it's for non-governmental systems only, and it's for small businesses that serve fewer than 500 or that have fewer than 500 employees. So if you're a non-governmental water system and you have fewer than 500 employees, it wouldn't hurt to submit an application to the payroll protection plan or to the EIDL, and to see if you might get some funding. Now, I will say that we've seen that the demand for those funds have skyrocketed, because it's not just for water utilities. This is for any kind of small business, and I don't know, how soon you might be able to get the funding, or what kind of challenges you might experience trying to go through that agency and that pot of money. But that's potentially available for non-governmental systems. Future federal stimulus, there's a lot of discussion about creating a fourth stimulus bill, and water and wastewater is high on the agenda. And this is coming from the president, it's coming from members of Congress. There are a lot of agencies out there that are really pushing for some kind of relief for water and wastewater systems. That could come in the form of direct relief. It could come in the form of subsidized loans and grants through the SRF programs or USDA or some of the other funding programs as well. So there may be some debt forgiveness or flexibility that might be coming down the line. Right now, I think it's a little too early, but you might want to contact your funding agencies right now. If you already have a loan, contact them and see if there's some kind of flexibility in paying, in deferring some of your debt service payments, or if they've got some plans going down the line to help you with that. And then some states may or may not have some financial assistance available for local governments and utilities. And for state-specific questions, we'll have to address those one by one. Locally, really the way that you can handle with losses of revenue, manage your costs as much as possible. Try to keep control of your costs and try to lower your water losses, lower some of the things, lower your energy costs as much as possible. Do what you can to lower your costs so that you can offset those deficits. Track your revenue losses. Make sure you're looking at your revenues not just every month, but if you can, every week. See what kind of condition that you're in so that you have an idea and you can start planning ahead of time earlier. And then ultimately, I think reserves. If you've been in any of our trainings, you know that we talk a lot about reserves and creating a reserve fund to be able to help you with situations that come up that are unanticipated. Well, COVID-19 is a perfect example of that. If you've already built a reserve, that's the point of having a reserve. You might have to dip into your reserve to offset some of those revenue losses. You will have a deficit this year, potentially, and the reserves should be there to help offset some of that and give you a little bit of time to build up your revenues again, whether it's through a rate increase or if operations return to normal. And if there are options for making use of low interest loans, interest is going to go down very quickly. So if you have capital projects, don't be afraid to look at funding programs right now and see if they have very low interest loans that you could tap into. There's a lot of discussion at the federal level to make sure that capital projects continue and you don't stop doing your capital projects just because you're dealing with issues right now that are more focused on COVID-19. I'm going to pause here. I know I've talked a lot about finances. I could take maybe a couple of questions and then save the rest for later. Heather and Savannah, was there any really pressing questions that I should address at this time?
I was just looking. We did have a comment that said the person was fairly certain that RWD rural water districts can apply for the payroll protection plan as non-profits. And then another question came in about whether state SRF programs might see additional funding to help assist utilities. I don't know, Shadi, if you've heard anything yet, whether the state SRF programs are expecting to see any kind of increase as part of this whole, stimulus COVID package. I don't think I've personally heard that, but I don't know if you have.
The latest I've heard is that that's part of the discussion on future stimulus. So right now, Congress is not in session, but when they come back, they'll be discussing more stimulus bills. But that is one that has been discussed, is whether or not they would provide more funding for the SRF programs as a mechanism to help water systems. And so there's at least support, but we can't predict whether or not that's actually going to go through and become a bill and then an act as well going forward. But it's definitely something that's being discussed for sure. Was there another question?
Right now, I think Savannah has the poll up of how long can you pay for all water system expenses under current conditions. So, so one comment had come in earlier about there wasn't a non-applicable response. Well, it turns out you can only have 5 responses on polls on webinars. So we took away the non-applicable. So if you're not a water utility, just don't fill out the poll. But if you are a water utility, if you could just answer the question that's up there now of how long can you pay for all water system expenses under your current conditions?
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. I promised Savannah I would, and I forgot. Sorry, Savannah. I think we can close it now. Let's see. All right, so, and I see the responses now. I found a way to do that while still sharing the screen. So it looks like most utilities, or not most, it's kind of evenly spread. You have some utilities that with your reserves currently, you might be okay, even under current conditions. Even if current conditions continue for a year, you would be probably okay to continue to pay your expenses. But there are a lot of utilities that are saying, you know what, if COVID-19 is going to last, or this situation continues for 7 to 12 months, then we might be in trouble then. But for for half a year, we'll be okay, we'll be fine. The ones that are saying that if COVID-19 continues for 2 months, we won't be able to pay our expenses. That's that's definitely a significant challenge, and I've gotten some calls about that too. And for those systems, if you are in that kind of situation where you can't even support or can't pay your bills for 2 months worth of current conditions, contact us, and we can try to work with you one-on-one, try to figure out some solutions for you as well. But this is, it kind of shows you what the hurt is going to be going forward. If COVID-19 conditions continue for a long time, more and more utilities obviously will kind of fall into that we need some help category. But it's kind of heartening to see that not a lot of utilities are saying it's an immediate problem for us at this time. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to pass on. Sorry, Heather, I might have gone a little bit long, but I'm going to pass it on to you to talk about some of the issues that you want to talk about. So let me share.
And as we're transitioning, I'm just going to answer one question that came in about what funding is available for tribes. And I did want to mention that EPA is currently organizing a webinar that's specifically related to tribes and coronavirus and funding and all of that. And I'll try to get more information. I don't have all of the sign-in information and all that, but what we'll do is we'll send that out to everybody who registered for this, just in case you have a need for the tribal webinar. We'll make sure you get that information, and more specifics will be provided for tribes at that time. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about finance. Now we're going to talk a little bit about management while the coronavirus situation is happening. And one of the things I wanted to mention is asset management. And if you've ever listened to any of the Environmental Finance Center webinars, you know that we talk a lot about asset management and how important it is. So I wanted to talk about just a specific aspect of asset management right now. And just considering the scenario of maybe you have very few operators, maybe you only have 1, maybe you have 2. What happens if those operators end up either sick, which would be very tragic, or if they're just in quarantine, like maybe they've been exposed to somebody and they have to be quarantined for a couple of weeks, and that there's a fairly long quarantine period with this virus. So you might end up where you have to have an operator come in to your system who has very little familiarity with the system, and you may not even have much access to the usual operator to help, even by phone, because if they're sick, that might be very difficult for them. So one of the things to think about is whether you have a map of your assets. And if you do, is it accessible to a new operator? So perhaps it's online and you need a password to get in. Can you leave instructions on how to access it? Can you print one out? If you can't leave instructions, is there a way to get it in at least a hard copy format? Print it in segments if it's a very big map. Leave it out for somebody. So think about that ahead of time of how you can get this mapping information to somebody else who might have to run your system, because that's going to be one of the most important things, is where are your assets, you know, where are your valves, where are your hydrants, that sort of thing. If you don't have a map, think about how you might very quickly be able to make up a map, even a simple hand-drawn one, so that, again, you're providing some help. There are lots of techniques to do something simple. There's lots of base maps, you know, Google Earth and all kinds of things that you can use to just draw on top of. If you want help with that, please reach out. There's going to be a poll at the end asking if you want some help. So if you just want some help on how to make a really simple map, you know, reach out to the EFCs and we can try to help get you started on just a really simple map. And I'm just talking about the very, very basics, so that at least if a new operator comes in, they know where your wells are, they know where your treatment units are, they know where valves, hydrants, that sort of stuff. Another thing is some of your employees might be working from home at this time. So we're not talking about the frontline operators now. Maybe there's some management type people at your utility who are not actually physically in the office, but they're working from home. This might actually be a time where you can work on your asset management plan more broadly, because you have some time to focus on it. And if you're trying to collect data on your assets, it can be done by one person at a time. So social distancing can be practiced while you're working on your asset management plan. And also think about developing maintenance plans right now and how to keep your equipment running. So normally if your equipment doesn't run well, you will have people who come in and fix it. You have repair teams, contractors who come in. Now is not the time for that type of thing. So we want to keep our equipment running as much as possible. So really think about the maintenance, think about what you're doing, how you're doing it, and try to keep that equipment, especially the vitally important equipment, try to keep that running as much as possible so you don't have to make repairs. Thinking about operation and maintenance plans, do you have an operation and maintenance plan for your facility? Again, just simple instructions of how it's supposed to run, what's supposed to happen, how it works. If you do have one, again, make sure it's accessible to everyone who might need to operate the facility, whether that might be your current staff or somebody from outside. So be really, really careful to make sure you have it somewhere, you know where it is, everybody knows where it is. And again, if you don't have one, consider developing one very quickly, making it accessible to everybody. It does not have to be fancy, just the basics. You know, where are the key on and off switches? Where are emergency shutoffs? Where's emergency generator? How does it work? When does it need to be tested? You know, how often do you run it? Where do you get your chemicals from? How do you order them? Where do you know, who's your backup? What are the main operational tasks per day? All of those types of things. You know, where are your test locations for routine monitoring? So keeping track of what are those normal things you have to do and making sure they're accessible. Again, if your operator is not able to come in, somebody else knows what to do and how to do it. So if you've never done one, now's the time. And again, quick and dirty, and we can help you if you'd like some help with that. Emergency equipment, do you have emergency equipment on site? And I've visited many water and wastewater treatment plants across the entire country. And I find a lot of times people don't know what emergency equipment they have. They don't know where it is. They don't know if it's in good working order. Now is the time to take stock of what you have and where it's at. Think about things that are both corona and non-corona related. So you have emergencies that have nothing to do with corona. You might have dangerous chemicals, you might have confined spaces. So there's already equipment that you need, but you need some extra equipment potentially during this time period for corona. You know, things like face masks, eyewear, protective clothing, in case you have to go someplace where you're not sure if there's corona, or if there is corona and you have to go there for some particular reason, you want to make sure you have all the protective equipment you need. And if you don't have it, where can you procure it? I know that it is somewhat difficult right now, but at least reach out and try to find out what you need. You know, give it some thought right now. Restarting customers who may have been shut off. We talked about earlier in the presentation about what if you had somebody who was previously shut off and you've decided you're going to turn them back on during this time period to make sure they have water service. Or what if you've turned off a customer because their business is closed, so you know, maybe they're closed for the next couple months during this corona period, and so you've decided to shut them off. What happens after you turn that customer back on? One of the questions that came in prior to the webinar related to, you know, what should you do? And I do want to mention it's good to have good flushing practices when you're going to turn somebody back on after a long shut-off period, or, you know, fairly lengthy. The American Water Works Association has recommendations on their website of what to do. And in general, you're thinking about things like turning all the fixtures on simultaneously, removing aerators and that sort of thing before you flush. And then also consider social distancing when talking to or working with your customers. So the latest message has been, assume that everybody might be carrying the virus. So when you're talking to your customers, make sure that you are keeping yourself safe. Perhaps you want to wear a mask or other protective gear. So you might have to walk them through how to flush. Hopefully you don't actually have to go into the home. You might be able to walk them through it. But if you do have to go in the home, again, remember your personal protective equipment. Compliance and data collection at this time period. One question that has come up, and I've heard this from many areas, is should you still worry about compliance during this pandemic? And there was some earlier sort of stuff that got in the news that said EPA wasn't going to do any enforcement or that type of thing during this time period. That was false information, at least in terms of drinking water. So the answer is absolutely, you want to keep your compliance up. It's more important than ever. We have to keep everybody safe as much as possible. So, and furthermore, EPA does expect all utilities to continue to comply. And we're presuming that every state is pretty much following suit, that you do have to meet compliance at this time. So things to think about, your location of your sample sites. So you may not even be able to get to some of your regulatory sampling locations right now. Some of them might be closed. The businesses might be closed, so you can't get in there. Some of them might have been a home that you had to enter or something like that. And if that's the case, you know, can you keep your operator protected at that time? So you might need to work with your state to find potential alternative sites if none of your usual sites can be accessed. So think about that, if you just where you're taking your samples and if that's going to be problematic. You're going to have to take samples, you might just have to have new locations, but make sure you work with your states to work on that. You might want to think about whether it's possible to install sample sites that are not inside houses or buildings. Some utilities have gone to separate sample sites that are tapped into their mains that are not inside a building to make it so you don't have to go into any place. You might have to do additional flushing if the business that uses lots of water is using a whole lot less. So perhaps you took a sample in a restaurant, while the restaurant is only doing takeout, so they're using a lot less water. Just think about, you might have to have more flushing to make sure you're getting the water from the main instead of what's been in the pipes in the building. Do you have backup lab for sample analysis? If you don't, consider getting one. Do you have enough bottles, reagents, all that sort of stuff to keep you going? And again, if you don't, talk to your labs about it and make sure, because again, EPA does expect you to comply during this time period. If there's any reason that you cannot meet compliance and you believe it's directly related to corona, and you want to try to avoid an actual violation, make sure you save all related data and information. Err on the side of collecting way more information than you need instead of less, because you're going to have to make a really good case, because they're not going to be just blanketly saying, okay, you're fine. So really keep that data, and if there is some particular problem, make sure you keep that data and you let your state or EPA folks know what's been going on and why this became a problem. Just some resilience measures. Regionalization is one measure that might work. You might not have time to regionalize right now, but it's something to think about for the next time. Is if you have a larger network, more employees, that sort of thing, you're going to be a little more resilient. Setting up water system cooperation networks. Reach out to your fellow operators, via phone. Talk to them, figure out ways to share things during emergencies. This is something you could do now, but think about it in the future. Asset management, we talked about inventory and mapping sorts of things that can help you. Having those reserve accounts that Shadi talked about. Increasing your days of cash on hand, which is how long can you go with the amount of money you have in the bank? How long can you go if nobody pays their bills? So we did see evidence in that one poll question that quite a few of you do have a good amount of cash on hand. So increasing that can really help you be resilient. Having your emergency response plan, go deeper than you ever thought before. A lot of people have responded that they went way deeper in their emergency response plan than they ever thought, and some didn't even have a deep enough response plan for what's happening. Think about tabletop exercises to prepare and test your plan. Increase your awareness of and use of remote technologies. Continue to use these even after the pressure is off, like maybe we're not in this home stay mode, but these technologies will work beyond. So continue to use those. Know who to call for a variety of things, and don't forget about these measures when the pressure is off, because the next emergency is probably on the horizon, whatever that might be. Some assistance and resources. There's resources from CDC, EPA, American Water Works, many different places, and these slides will be sent to everybody, so you have the links and you'll have this information. There are resources to help you for staffing if you're having a shortage. So there are things like the WARN program, the Mutual Aid Assistance for Drinking Water. WARN is free to join. You don't have to do anything when requested, so that's a really good place to go. And there are other assistance providers that can help you find staffing, or possibly even your state agencies. Some of them right now are trying to help provide staffing if you run short of staffing. One of the questions we received prior to this event was, what should assistance providers do, including AWWA, to help? One of the things I think is important is continuing to support the WARN and other staffing assistance programs. AWWA has made some resources free at this time, and the Trending in an Instant manual that's down in the bottom right-hand corner is one of those. So I think continuing to do more of that, make as much as possible free right now to help people. There's lots of free webinars that are going on. Many of them are very timely and informative, and they've been really good information, so continue to make those available. Help utilities connect with suppliers of equipment and labs if the normal supply chains are cut. It's super important that we continue disinfection processes right now. It appears from all the data that disinfection is working well to kill the coronavirus, but we have to have the disinfection to make that work. So make sure you have places to go if you're running out of chlorine or whatever disinfectant you use. So make sure that you have backups if that's going to be a problem. EPA has lots of resources available. One really good one is the Pandemic Incident Action Checklist. That's a really good resource. I just have a couple of pages of it up on the screen right now, but that's a great resource to check out. It has lots and lots of really good things to think about and do to kind of get yourself prepared. And then there are some resources from the EFC network related to coronavirus and a lot of other things. There are funding tables available and that sort of thing. There's small system blogs that have all kinds of information. And then there's the ability to request technical assistance at this time. So there are lots of things that you might want technical assistance from. Please reach out to us if there's any way we can help. We would love to help you right now with finance or management issues that might be occurring. So I think there's a poll up now that would let us know if you're interested in working with the EFCN to advise on your financial condition management, that type of stuff, as a result of the COVID-19. So if you are interested, please say yes.
And we'll leave this poll open for just a few more moments. And getting ready to close it in 3, 2, 1. Perfect. And also too, in the chat box, I'm sending out the evaluation link for today's webinar.
Heather, while we're doing this, we have a comment or a question, actually more like comments. The problem with recommending additional flushing is that it's hard for staff to flush the system while maintaining social distancing. Any tips that you have on that?
And I think that is absolutely true. I totally agree with you that trying to get it flushed, I think there's a couple of possibilities. One is if you can get completely PPE'd where you are completely covered and you couldn't be infected the way that public health people do it, the healthcare providers. So you'd have to have the full, N95s and all that sort of stuff. If you can do that, then it might be possible to go to somebody's home. But in general, I think it's going to be giving instructions to homeowners, and that may have to be done in some format other than a face-to-face discussion. You might have to do it over the phone. You might have to leave instructions, written instructions at the door. I think it's going to require some creativity of how to do things that we normally do face-to-face in a different way. There are these technologies like Zoom. You can get a Zoom account for free, and if you do something like that, they could use their camera, and perhaps, if they had a Zoom on their phone, they could walk through their house and you could talk to them as they're showing you what the fixtures look like and that type of thing. I think we have to really think creatively right now, because our normal practices for this type of thing are not going to be a good idea. You're not necessarily going to want to go into somebody's house at this time and help them. So we will have to think long and hard about it. And I think that's something to maybe talk to some of your fellow operators about, how have they done some of this type of thing, and just talk amongst your utility of what would be a good way to do this and keep us safe, because that is number one. How do you keep the operators safe while you're trying to do some of these things?
Thank you, Heather. There was a couple of questions that came in back when we were talking about federal funding and these Small Business Administration programs, the Payroll Protection Plan and EIDL. I've mentioned that I know that the non-governmental systems are potentially eligible to apply for those. The questions that came in were asking, well, what about governmental? Are we sure that the local governments that are small don't also qualify? And I will have to actually check on that. So I will have to go back. If you're unsure, you can always go on the Small Business Administration's website and try to submit an application, and they'll tell you whether you're eligible or not. I went on the website right now looking for that, and I couldn't find it, clearly stated on their website that local governments are not eligible. But they may define business to be a non-governmental entity. So, and I just can't find that on their website right now. So I'm happy to look into that a little bit more. If you're interested, feel free to send me an email about that. And then another comment that came in, I know we're running over on time, appreciate people's patience. One more comment, Heather, and I think we can probably wrap it up, is you'll need to have hazmat disposal procedures for PPEs. I don't know if you mentioned that one or if you want to add anything to that.
I didn't, but I think you are correct. You're going to want to use the procedures that the healthcare providers are using. So if you are using your PPE for COVID, whatever procedures you normally use for non-COVID emergencies, you should use. So whatever the normal stuff, working with chemicals, confined spaces, et cetera. I mean, you have a lot of protective stuff that you do anyway. So follow whatever procedures are normal for that. If you have something related to the COVID-19, where you're using PPE for that purpose and you're potentially contaminated, follow the healthcare, what the healthcare providers do. You're going to have to follow those same kinds of procedures to dispose of your PPE. So you might want to reach out to, local hospitals or university healthcare centers who are using a lot of the PPE right now and ask them what they're doing, ask them how they're disposing of their equipment to make sure that you're following proper procedures. So yes, please follow all proper procedures for disposing of the PPE after you've used it.
All right, thank you. I think that's all the time that we have right now. I noticed that there were some more questions that have come in. We'll try to respond to you individually afterwards. And
there's one more thing that I should mention is the Rural Community Assistance Partnership has also mentioned that they might be able to help with staffing type concerns. So we had mentioned the Rural Water Association, so the Rural Community Assistance Partnership might also be able to help with that. So reach out to any and all resources if you're having staffing issues at this time, or reach out just to, if you anticipate you might have some staffing issues, you might want to reach out ahead of time and just find out what's available in case you should need it.
Thank you everybody for your time. I'm going to pass this back on to Savannah to close things out, but we appreciate and we know that we haven't got to everybody. We'll try to respond again, and feel free to reach out to us or to contact us if you need some direct assistance from us as well. But Savannah, all yours now.
Thanks, Shadi. You pretty much closed it up. We will be in touch for questions that weren't answered today, and you will receive a follow-up email that includes links to all of the follow-up material. Thank you, Heather, Shadi, and Aaron for being here today.
And thank you again for all of you on the webinar who are water utility personnel and all of you who work with water utility personnel. Thanks for all you're doing right now to keep the water safe and to keep it running. You're doing a heck of a job. Keep it up, and you have our great thanks for what you do.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.